Nobody in the boardroom that morning knew that the woman refilling their water glasses understood every single word the two men in the corner were whispering. And those two men were planning to make sure Kim Jin-woo never left Seoul alive. Hey besties, welcome to Seoul Bond Stories. If you're loving this intrigue already, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories like this. And drop a comment below, letting me know where you're tuning in from. Feel free to share your thoughts on the story along the line whilst watching. Also share with a friend who loves a good thriller. It means the world to us and our growing channel. Now let's get back to the story. Sylphie Sloane had been in Korea for 8 months. She'd come from Jacksonville, Florida, chasing a job offer that sounded too good to be true. Personal executive assistant to the CEO of KJW Global, one of the most powerful technology conglomerates in all of Asia. She'd almost turned it down. Seoul was far from home, far from her mother's cooking and her little sister's voice on the phone every Sunday. But the salary was extraordinary, and Sylphie had never been the kind of woman who let fear make her decisions. So she packed 2 suitcases, said her goodbyes at Jacksonville International, and flew 12 hours into a life she hadn't yet imagined. She hadn't expected him to be like that. Kim Jin-woo, 36 years old. White hair that fell across his forehead in a way that should have looked ridiculous, but instead looked like something out of a magazine. A face carved from precision and intention, jaw sharp, eyes darker than a Seoul night in December. He'd a body built like he spent his mornings doing pull-ups on the edge of a skyscraper. He walked into every room like the room had been waiting for him. His presence was the kind you felt before you saw him. A shift in the air, a straightening of spines, a collective holding of breath. He was also, without question, the most difficult man Sylphie had ever worked for in her life. Not cruel, not dismissive, just exacting. He moved through the world at a speed that most people couldn't match, and he had little patience for those who fell behind. His standards were impossibly high. His schedule was a military operation. His communication style was so stripped of warmth that you sometimes wondered if he ran on code instead of blood. He had never, in 8 months, asked her how her weekend was. He had never commented on her appearance, not once, though she'd caught his eyes briefly on her more times than a man that controlled would probably want to admit. He paid her exceptionally well. He respected her competence completely, and he was absolutely, terminally, unreachably closed off. Sylphie had made peace with that. She wasn't there to thaw him. She was there to manage his calendar, filter his communications. She wasn't there to thaw him. She was there to manage his calendar, filter his communications, coordinate with 6 department heads across 3 time zones, and make sure the most powerful man in the building never had to wonder where he was supposed to be or what was supposed to happen next. She was good at it. Brilliant at it, actually. And for 8 months, that had been enough. Until the morning of the Dejin summit. KJW Global was hosting 40 of South Korea's most powerful business leaders for a 2-day closed summit at the Sunjin Tower's private conference floor. The agenda covered everything from semiconductor partnerships to green energy contracts. Jin-woo had been preparing for this for 6 weeks. Sylphie had coordinated every detail. The catering, the simultaneous translation services, the security clearance vetting, the breakout session scheduling, the presentation tech, all of it. What she hadn't coordinated was the 2 men who arrived in the catering crew. She noticed them first when she was doing her pre-summit walkthrough at 6:45 in the morning, 3 hours before the summit began. 2 men she didn't recognize, not unusual for contract catering staff, but something about them snagged her attention. They moved too deliberately. They weren't arranging food. They were studying the room, clocking exits, noting sightlines. Sylphie kept moving, kept her face neutral, just kept refilling her clipboard like she was checking off a list. She was very good at being underestimated. It was actually one of her greatest professional assets. People saw a gorgeous black woman from Florida with natural hair and a smile that could light up a corridor, and they thought, assistant, background, decoration. They rarely looked long enough to notice that she was watching everything. She positioned herself near the service corridor entrance and pretended to check her phone. That was when she heard it. The two men were speaking quietly to each other in Russian. And Sylphie Sloane had been speaking Russian since she was 14 years old. Her mother had been an ESL teacher with a lifelong love affair with languages. And she'd raised Sylphie and her sister in a household where learning another language wasn't optional. It was dinner conversation. Sylphie had taken to Russian with a particular intensity, had pursued it through high school, and then through her international business degree at Florida State, had even spent a summer in St. Petersburg before the world made that complicated. She was fluent, not textbook fluent. Conversationally, culturally, idiomatically fluent in ways that Google Translate could never replicate. So when the first man said quietly, the device is secured beneath the third presentation panel from the left. Remote trigger. I'll be positioned on the service floor when Kim takes the podium. Sylphie didn't need a translation. She understood every word. Her body went completely still even as she continued scrolling her phone. Her face showed nothing. Her heartbeat, on the other hand, had just become a drumline. They were talking about Kim Jin-woo. They were talking about a device. They were talking about a trigger. She kept listening, head down, breathing measured, while every nerve in her body was screaming. Timing is critical, the second man said. The moment he begins the opening address, before anyone has a chance to react, the chaos will be significant enough that we exit through the service elevators before security establishes a perimeter. And the other one? Park has the access codes for the security feed. 15-second blackout. That's all we need. Sylphie tucked her phone into her pocket and walked calmly to the nearest corner, turned it, and then pressed her back against the wall and allowed herself exactly 5 seconds of terror. 5 seconds of her heart slamming against her ribs, of her hands trembling, out of the full weight of what she'd just heard crashing down on her like a wave. Then, she pushed off the wall and started thinking. She had 3 hours. The summit opened at 10. Jin-woo arrived at 9:30 for pre-summit briefings. It was currently 6:52 in the morning. She had time, but not a lot of it, and she had to be smart, because if she panicked and moved wrong, those men would know they'd been heard. If they knew they'd been heard and she was the only witness. She didn't finish that thought. First, she needed to tell someone. But who? Tower security was an obvious answer, and except that the man on the phone had mentioned someone named Park who had access to the security feed. She didn't know which Park. KJW Global employed 4 people named Park in various departments. If she walked straight to building security and one of those officers was the wrong Park, yet she'd hand herself and everything she knew directly to the people who needed her silent. She needed to get to Jin-woo directly. Except that at 6:52 in the morning, Kim Jin-woo was in his penthouse residence on the 47th floor, and Sylphie's access badge did not clear her for the residential floors. She had never been up there. He kept his professional and personal lives in airtight separate compartments, and she had always respected that boundary. Today, she was going to have to break it. She pulled out her phone and called his direct line. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Of course it did. He screened calls before 9 unless she'd pre-flagged them as urgent. She texted instead, "Mr. Kim, I need 5 minutes. It's urgent and it cannot wait. I'm sorry for the hour." She stared at her phone. Nothing. She called again. Voicemail. She typed, "I overheard something at the venue that you need to know about before the summit. Please call me." Still nothing. Sylphie looked up at the ceiling of the empty corridor, breathed out slowly, and made a decision that her Jacksonville girl common sense and her 8 months of working for the most exacting man in Seoul told her was either very brave or very career-ending. She was going up to 47. She went to the service elevator, the same one the 2 men had mentioned, which made her stomach turn, but it was the only card that would take her up without a residential badge. She had clearance for service access as part of her summit coordination role. She stepped in, pressed the button, and rode up 47 floors with her hands folded and her face arranged into something that looked significantly calmer than she felt. The elevator opened into a private lobby. Muted, elegant. Oh, exactly what you'd expect. A single security guard at the desk looked up sharply when he saw her. "Ma'am, this floor is, I'm Sylphie Sloane, executive assistant to Mr. Kim. I need to speak with him immediately. It's a security matter regarding the summit this morning." She kept her voice level and authoritative, into the voice she used when she had to move mountains without raising it. "Please call him directly and tell him his assistant is at the door. He'll want to see me." The guard hesitated, picked up a phone, said something quiet into it that she couldn't hear, then looked at her with an expression that had shifted from skeptical to uncertain. One moment. She waited, counted her heartbeats, got to 37 before the inner door clicked open and Kim Jin-woo appeared in the doorway. He was not in his usual suit. He was in a plain black shirt, sleeves pushed to the elbows, dark joggers, barefoot. His white hair was slightly undone, jaw falling forward rather than swept back. He looked human, more human than she had ever seen him, and she had worked alongside him for 8 months through every kind of professional fire. He also looked extraordinarily alert for 6:55 in the morning, yet his eyes scanning her immediately with the kind of sharp assessment she'd become familiar with in boardrooms. Sylphie. He never called her by her first name in professional settings. That he did now, at 6:55 in his doorway, told her he'd already understood from the tone of her messages that something was wrong. "Come in?" She walked in. He closed the door behind her. The apartment was extraordinary. One entire wall of glass looking out over Seoul, still glazed in early morning mist, and the Han River a silver thread in the distance. But she wasn't there to appreciate the view. "Tell me," he said simply. And she did, quickly, clearly, without dramatizing it. Her voice was steady because she needed it to be. She told him about the two men, their position in the catering staff, what they'd said, and here she switched briefly into Russian, repeating their exact words, verbatim, so he could hear the language, the phrasing, the precision of the threat, and then back to English, and giving him the translation detail by detail. The device beneath the third panel, the trigger timing, the service elevator exit route, the security feed blackout, the name Park. She finished. He was completely still. For a moment, nothing in his face moved. He was doing what she'd watched him do in negotiations when someone dropped information that changed the entire shape of a situation, absorbing it, restructuring his understanding, calculating what came next. Feeling nothing visible on the outside while clearly processing everything on the inside at a speed that was almost inhuman. Then, he said, very quietly,
"You speak Russian."
Yes. I've been fluent since I was a teenager. I've never needed to mention it before today.
No, you haven't.
He crossed to a cabinet, opened it, and picked up a phone that was different from the one she'd seen him use in the office, a secondary device. She realized. Something kept separate.
I'm calling my personal security chief, not the building security team.
Smart. I didn't know who Park was.
He paused in the middle of dialing and looked at her fully. You didn't alert building security because you were protecting the integrity of the information. I couldn't risk. Another pause. Something moved briefly in his eyes that she couldn't quite name. Give me 5 minutes. What followed was the most compressed, precise 45 minutes of Sylphie Sloane's life. Jin-woo's personal security chief, a man named Hwang Tae-yang, who arrived on the floor within 12 minutes, was nothing like the building's security team. He was quiet, all meticulous, and radiated the kind of calm that came from people who had trained for exactly these situations. Sylphie repeated everything to him in his presence, this time with Jinwoo translating the Russian portions for Hwang, who was already on his own phone before she finished. Speaking in Korean, she could follow. "We need to identify the two men in the catering crew without alerting them," Jinwoo said to Hwang. "Already sending someone," Hwang said. "Plain clothes. He'll photograph them through the kitchen service window. The park name, we need to cross-reference against everyone with security feed access. I've already pulled the list. There are 4 parks with that clearance. I'm running background checks on all 4 right now." The device under the 3rd panel. "Bomb disposal unit. I'm requesting them now. Discreet entry through the loading dock. They'll sweep the room before we open the floor to anyone." Hwang glanced at Sylphie with something that looked not almost like appreciation. "She bought us time by coming directly upstairs." Jinwoo didn't look at her. He was reading something on his secondary phone. Yes, she did. By 8:15, the bomb disposal team had confirmed the device. Not a bluff. Real, sophisticated, shaped exactly the way the man in the corridor had described. They removed it quietly, efficiently, without triggering anything. By 8:40, security footage reviewed by a team that did not include any of the 4 parks had identified both men in the catering crew. By 8:50, all 4 parks had been assessed, and one, an overnight security monitor named Park Sung-min, who had been employed at the tower for 14 months, was quietly detained in a back office while he was still unaware that anything had gone wrong. The 2 men in the catering crew were apprehended at 9:03 before the first summit guest had arrived in the service corridor adjacent to the conference floor. They didn't go quietly, but Hwang's team was significantly better prepared than they had anticipated. The Dejin summit opened on time at 10 o'clock. Kim Jinwoo walked to the podium in a room that had been swept, secured, and sealed. Delivered his opening address with the same commanding precision he brought to everything. No one in that room knew how close it had been. The 40 guests sat in their seats and watched a man who appeared entirely in control because he was now. Sylphie stood at the back of the room, as she always did during major events, managing details, watching the door, tracking the schedule, doing her job. About 3 minutes into his address, Jinwoo glanced up from his prepared remarks. Not at the audience, at the back of the room, at her. It lasted exactly 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds, something crossed his face that she had never seen there before in 8 months of daily proximity. She looked away and checked her clipboard. It was only after the summit's first morning session broke for coffee at 11:30 that things became strange for Sylphie. Because instead of heading into the networking clusters with the other guests as he normally would, Jinwoo crossed the room to where she was standing, and he said, with the kind of directness that apparently extended to everything he did, "Come with me." She followed him to a small adjoining room off the main conference floor, a quiet private space with one long window. He closed the door, turned around, and for a moment just stood there, studying her with that dark and assessing gaze in a way that felt different from any of the dozens of times he'd done it across boardroom tables. "I owe you my life," he said. Not dramatically, matter-of-factly, as if he were stating something from a balance sheet. "You don't owe me anything," Sylphie said. "It's my job to look after your interests." "Your job description does not include counterintelligence." "It kind of does," she said, "under other duties as required." He stared at her, and then something happened that she genuinely had not seen coming in any of the hundreds of hours she'd spent in close professional proximity to this man. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, not yet, not him, but the architecture of one, the promise of one. "You went to my residential floor without authorization at 6:55 in the morning," he said. "Yes. My building security told me later that you spoke to the guard with enough authority that he hesitated to turn you away. I can be very direct when the situation calls for it." "Evidently." He turned partially toward the window. You've worked for me for 8 months. 8 months and 11 days. He turned back. And in that time, you've managed my schedule, restructured my communication system, mediated 3 interdepartmental conflicts, successfully negotiated the Lotta partnership timeline when it was 48 hours from collapse, and kept me from missing my sister's birthday dinner twice. She blinked. She hadn't known he'd noticed any of that. He'd never said a word about any of it. I try to be thorough. You're exceptional. He said it without inflection, the way you'd state a fact. I knew it within 3 weeks of hiring you, but I didn't say so because... He paused, and it's something tightening briefly in his expression. I don't say things like that. I don't... Another pause. I'm aware that I'm not easy to work for. Sylphie felt something careful and tentative stir in her chest. She kept her face composed. You're direct. You have high standards. I respond to that. You respond to it because you have higher standards than I do, he said, which startled her. What you did this morning, coming to me directly, protecting the intelligence, managing your fear well enough to act systematically rather than impulsively, that required more discipline than most of the people who work in this building are capable of. She was quiet for a moment. I was terrified. I know. And something in the way he said it made her feel like he'd somehow looked inside her and seen exactly what those 45 minutes in the corridor and the elevator and the 47th floor had cost her. That's what made it brave. She looked down at her clipboard, then back up at him. Are you all right? He seemed slightly surprised by the question, and as if very few people had asked him that directly. I'm fine. That's not an answer. Someone tried to kill you this morning. He considered this. I'm processing it. I will be fine. He looked at her with an expression that was more open than anything she'd seen from him before, raw, yet somehow less defended. I should have someone check on you as well. This was a significant event to witness. I'm from Florida, she said. We're built sturdy. This time the smile actually arrived. Small, brief, startled out of him, but completely real. It changed his face in a way that she felt in her sternum, and she made a careful note to herself to not think about that too much. I'm going to increase your security detail, he said, returning to practicality the way a man like him would, reaching for the solid ground of logistics when other terrain became uncertain. Until we fully understand the scope of who commissioned this, you could be considered a loose end. Huang will coordinate. All right. And I'd like to have a full debrief with you and Huang this evening. 7 o'clock. I'll be there. He nodded, reached for the door, then stopped with his hand on the handle. Sylphie, he said, and the use of her name again stopped her completely. What you did this morning, I want you to know that I see it, that I see you. He didn't look at her when he said it. He said it to the door. I'm aware that I haven't always made that visible. Then he opened the door and walked back into the summit and was immediately the most powerful person in the room again. As Sylphie stood in the small side room with her clipboard against her chest and thought, very privately, that Kim Jinwoo was turning out to be a great deal more complicated than his calendar suggested. Hit that like button if you're already feeling this, because the story is just getting started. She got through the rest of the summit on professional autopilot. Nobody except Jinwoo and Huang knew what had happened that morning. The guests networked and debated and signed preliminary agreements and ate an exceptional lunch, and Sylphie coordinated all of it with her usual efficiency, while a part of her mind kept pulling her back to that small room with the window and the sound of him saying, "I see you," to the door. She drove home that evening with a 2-person security detail that she pretended wasn't making her feel like a dignitary, and she called her mother from her apartment and didn't tell her anything except that she'd had a long day. Her mother, who had a radar for her daughter's emotional states that operated at a frequency unavailable to science, said, "Baby, you sound like you're carrying something heavy. You can put it down when you talk to me." and Sylphie almost told her everything, except that she knew her mother would book a flight to Seoul within the hour, so she just said, "I'm good. Mama, I'm handling it," and meant it. She was handling it. The 7 o'clock debrief with Jinwoo and Hwang lasted 2 hours. It was comprehensive and methodical, and somewhat healing in the way that productive action is always healing when you've been frightened. It put structure around the formless terror of the morning and turned it into something manageable and documented. Hwang walked them through everything that had been confirmed. The funding trail for the two operatives traced back to a competitor consortium that had twice tried to outbid KJW Global for a major government infrastructure contract. The attack had been motivated by business. If KJW Global's CEO died in the opening minutes of the Dejin summit, the company would be destabilized at precisely the moment when the government contract decision was being finalized. It was ruthless. It was calculated. It was the kind of thing that happened in the world Kim Jinwoo operated in, and it would never have been stopped without the particular combination of Sylphie Sloane's fluency in Russian and her willingness to climb 47 floors before 7 in the morning. By the end of the debrief, Hwang was openly respectful toward her in the way that only someone who had assessed her response under pressure and found it competent could be. Jinwoo was less openly anything. He was always less openly anything, but he walked her to the elevator himself when it was done, which he had never done before in 8 months, and he said, "Get some sleep," with a quiet directness that felt almost like care. "You too," she said. He looked at her. "I will try." She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. She leaned her head back against the wall and decided that she was absolutely not going to make something out of nothing, yet that the events of the day had been extreme enough to make anyone read significance into small moments, and that Kim Jinwoo walking her to an elevator and saying, "Get some sleep," was not a declaration of any kind. It was just decency. And she was a grown professional woman from Jacksonville who knew better. She absolutely knew better. 2 weeks passed. The investigation concluded. The two operatives were charged. Park Sungmin cooperated with authorities. The competitor consortium's involvement triggered a formal inquiry that would take months to fully unravel. KJW Global's security. Our infrastructure was completely overhauled. New team, new protocols, a new layered clearance system that Hwang designed and that Sylphie helped him implement from a communications and coordination standpoint. Life returned to something resembling its previous shape. Except that Kim Jinwoo had started saying good morning. It was such a small thing, such an embarrassingly small thing that she felt faintly ridiculous for noticing it. But every morning when she arrived and set up his schedule briefing, he came in and he said, "Good morning, Sylphie," before she launched into the day's agenda. He had never done this before, not once in 8 months. He had arrived, she had begun the briefing, and they had moved. Now there was good morning, with her name, every single day, said in a voice that was slightly different from his boardroom voice. Lower, less brisk. The way a voice sounds when it isn't performing. He also started asking once a week or so how she was. Not in a survey way, in a, he seemed to actually want to know, way. She told him, carefully, small things. That her sister had called and was applying to grad school. That she'd found a Korean cooking class she was taking on Saturdays and was specifically trying to master kimchi jjigae because she'd become obsessed with it since moving to Seoul. That she'd gotten slightly lost on a weekend walk in Bukshan Hanok village and had ended up having coffee at a place she never would have found on purpose, and it had been one of her favorite afternoons in the city. He listened to all of this with that total attention he gave to everything, and once, when she mentioned Bukshan, he said, "There's a courtyard on the south side of the village that most people miss. Behind the wooden gate with the faded blue trim. It's worth finding." And then he returned to the agenda, but she wrote it down. She found the courtyard the following Saturday. It was extraordinary. A small, quiet space with an old persimmon tree and stone benches and light that fell through the branches in a way that made everything look like it existed slightly outside of ordinary time. She sat there for a long time. She took one photograph. She almost sent it to him, and then didn't. Because that felt like a line she hadn't confirmed she was allowed to cross. Then he appeared at her office door one afternoon. Not his office, her office, the small one adjacent to his with the glass partition, and he said, without preamble, "I want to thank you properly for what you did 3 weeks ago. I've been trying to determine what that looks like, and I realize I've been overthinking it." She looked up from her screen. "You don't need to do anything." "I'm aware I don't need to. I'd like to." He leaned against the door frame, which was the most casual physical posture she'd seen from him in a professional setting. "Dinner. This Friday. Somewhere without an agenda or a meeting format." She looked at him for a moment. She was a professional. She was his employee. She was spectacularly aware of all of those facts. She was also a woman who had spent 3 weeks noticing that Kim Jin-woo said good morning with her name every day, and who had found the courtyard behind the blue gate, and who had not sent the photograph because she'd been uncertain, and she was really, very tired of being uncertain. "Dinner," she said. "Yes. All right." Something settled in his expression. 7:30. I'll send you the address. "You could just tell me now." He almost smiled. "I could." He pushed off the doorframe. "Young-sik. You know it?" She knew it by reputation. Everyone in Seoul who cared about food knew Young-sik by reputation. "I'll be there," she said. He nodded and walked back to his office. She looked at her screen, at the cursor blinking in her document, at the reflection of herself in the dark glass of the partition. She looked like a woman who was trying to look like she was fine and doing an approximately 75% successful job of it. Her phone buzzed. Her sister. "How's Seoul? How's the terrifyingly beautiful boss? Give me something." Sylphie looked at the message, looked at the partition. She typed back, "Getting dinner with him Friday. Pray for me." Her sister's response was 17 exclamation points. Friday came in the way that days you've been quietly anticipating always come, both faster and slower than they should. The hours behaving inconsistently until the moment you're actually in it. Young-sik was as beautiful as its reputation. Private, subtly lit, the kind of place where the space itself tells you that the evening is meant to matter. Jin-woo was already there when she arrived. She noticed that he'd arrived before her, that he wasn't the kind of man to be strategically late, and he stood when she walked in, which was so classically courteous that it caught her slightly off guard. He was in a dark suit without a tie. His white hair was down, falling slightly forward. She needed to stop cataloging how he looked and focus on the fact that there was a menu in front of her. They talked. This was the part that she hadn't quite anticipated, not that dinner would be awkward. She'd known it wouldn't be awkward. Almost she was too competent at conversation, and he was too precisely direct for awkwardness to thrive between them. What she hadn't anticipated was that it would be easy. That he would ask her about Jacksonville with genuine curiosity and listen to her description of growing up between the beach and her mother's kitchen with the quality of attention that he gave nothing casually. That she would ask him about his family and he would answer. Honestly, a complicated history with a father who'd built the first iteration of what became KJW Global, and a complicated grief that came with inheriting something built by someone who hadn't fully trusted you to carry it. That he would tell her this, quietly, over the second course, and she would understand it from the inside out, because she'd spent 8 months watching what it looked like when someone tried to prove to a ghost that they'd been wrong to doubt him. "You've been driving yourself," she said.
Yes.
He considered this. "Yes. For him or for you?" A longer pause.
I think you know the difference.
"I stopped being able to tell the difference some time ago."
Because looking at it was harder than just moving.
You looked at him across the table. "I think you know the difference," she said. "I think you stopped letting yourself look at it, because looking at it was harder than just moving." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're remarkably direct." "I learned it from my boss." That got the smile again, fuller this time, less restrained, more genuinely his. It did the same thing to her sternum that it had done before, but she was beginning to accept that the sternum situation was not going to resolve itself with willpower. They stayed for 3 hours. They talked about things that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with who they actually were beneath their professional surfaces. She told him about her year in St. Petersburg, and the summer that had made her Russian conversational and had also made her cold weather tolerant. He told her about the year after his father's death when he'd nearly walked away from all of it, had come very close to handing the company to the board and disappearing, and had stayed because of one conversation with his sister at 3 a.m. in a parking garage outside a hospital where his father had finally, after 18 months, let go. She did not know, until he told her this, that he had a sister who mattered to him this much. She'd known there was a sister, she'd seen her name in the calendar, yet had managed the birthday dinner reminders, but she hadn't known what the sister meant. People were different from what they showed you in offices. This she knew. Kim Jin-woo was significantly different. When they finally left, the Seoul night was cool and clear. The kind of autumn evening that makes the city feel like it's showing off. They stood on the pavement outside and she looked up at the sky and breathed it in, and he stood beside her for a moment without saying anything. Which with any other person would have felt like an absence, and with him felt like a kind of presence. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "Thank you for not going home after the summit," he said. "For staying in Seoul. For coming to work the next day." She looked at him. "I wasn't going anywhere." "I know," he said. "But I'm glad." She held that quietly for a moment, the particular weight of it. "Jin-woo, she said, using his name for the first time without the formal address. It came out more naturally than she'd expected. And she watched something shift in his face when she said it. "Yes, I found the courtyard." He looked at her. "The one in Bukshan." "Behind the blue gate?" She held his gaze. "It was the best afternoon I've had in this city." Something in his expression shifted in a way she recognized as meaning he felt something he didn't yet know what to do with. She'd learned to read him in 8 months. She could see the work it cost him to stay still instead of deflecting. Now the particular effort of someone who had built walls, discovering that the walls no longer felt protective. "I'd like to show you somewhere else," he said. "Next week, if you'd like that." "I'd like that," she said. He nodded. She called her car. He waited until it arrived before he moved toward his own. And just before she got in, he said her name once more, "Sylphie," and she turned. "Once again, thank you for coming to dinner with me." She smiled. "You're welcome." "You really are outstanding," he said. "Thinking back to the summit incident, you were terrified and you did it anyway. I'd say the same about you." "Yes." A pause. "I've been thinking about that. About how much of courage is just being afraid and moving anyway." "All of it," she said. "That's all of it." He looked at her with that undefended expression she'd first seen in his doorway at 6:55 in the morning, in the plain black shirt and bare feet, before the armor went back on. "Good night, Sylphie." "Good night, Jin-woo." She got in the car. She didn't look back. She looked out the window at the city passing by and thought about what it felt like to be seen by someone who was still learning to see, genuinely, slowly, at great personal cost, and realized it felt like something she wanted to stay close to. 6 weeks after the summit, on a Tuesday morning that bore absolutely no resemblance to the Tuesday morning that had nearly ended in disaster, Sylphie sat across from Jin-woo in his office reviewing the quarterly projections for the infrastructure partnership that KJW Global had ultimately won, the very contract the competitor consortium had tried to prevent them from securing by removing Jin-woo from the picture entirely. The irony was not lost on either of them. It came up occasionally, quietly, the way significant things do, not dramatized, just acknowledged. They tried to end the story, she said once, reviewing the contract documents. And instead, they wrote the part that made it worth telling, he said, not looking up from his screen. She'd looked at him then, this man with white hair and a face built for distance who was learning, slowly and with great intention, the architecture of closeness. And she'd thought, yes, exactly. The next morning, he was reading something on his tablet with the focused expression he wore when he was working through a problem, and she was updating his afternoon schedule. And there was a companionable quiet between them that would have been inconceivable 4 months ago. His assistant manager had poked her head in twice to confirm things, and had given Sylphie a look both times that communicated approximately 1,000 things without saying a single one of them. Sylphie's phone lit up. Her sister again, who had developed an apparently inexhaustible interest in her Seoul life. Update. Immediately. What is happening? Sylphie looked at the message, looked up at Jinwoo, who had set down his tablet and was now looking at her with the quiet attention he'd started directing at her more and more openly, and with less effort at concealing it. "Everything all right?" he asked. "My sister," she said. "She wants updates." "What kind of updates?" She held his gaze, the kind that answer the question of whether there's anything worth updating her about. He stood up from his desk, walked around it in that deliberate way he walked toward, beyond anything he'd decided to stop avoiding. Stopped a few feet from her. "I think," he said carefully, "that there is." She tilted her head. "That's a very lawyerly answer. I'm a businessman. I hedge." "You don't. Actually, you're one of the most direct people I've ever met." "I'm learning to be direct about things that aren't business." She waited. "I'm learning," he said, "that walls make better architecture than living arrangements." A pause. Someone I respect considerably pointed that out to me recently. Not in those words, but the meaning was clear. "Someone you respect," she said. "Someone I..." He stopped, started again. "Someone who came to my door at 6:55 in the morning because she wouldn't let someone she worked for get hurt, even when she was afraid. Someone who found a courtyard behind a blue gate and had the grace not to make me feel like I was slow for not having shown it to her sooner. Someone who speaks Russian with an accent that I've been told is remarkably clean for someone who learned it in Florida." His voice was steady, but his face was the most unguarded she'd seen it. "Someone I'd like to know more of. All of, if she'd allow that." Sylphie was quiet for a long moment. "Jinwoo," she said. "Yes. If you say something like that to a woman from Jacksonville, you should be prepared for her to be very direct in return." "I'm counting on it." She smiled. "Then, yes, all of me, if you're patient." "I'm capable of extraordinary patience when something matters," he said. "Is that a business skill or a personal one?" "I'm beginning to think they're the same skill applied differently." And the smile, his smile, the real one, the one that changed the whole topography of his face, arrived completely and without reservation. It was the most beautiful thing she'd seen in Seoul. And Seoul was an extraordinarily beautiful city. She texted her sister back, "Tell Mom I'm staying in Seoul." Her sister replied instantly, "I knew it. I knew it. The white-haired CEO. Pay up, I told you." Sylphie turned her phone face down on her desk and laughed genuinely, the kind of laugh that rises up before you can organize it, and across from her, Kim Jinwoo looked at her laughing and did something she would later describe to her sister as the single most devastating thing she'd witnessed in her adult life. He laughed too. Fully. Quietly. Real. It turned out that the most powerful man in Seoul had a laugh that sounded exactly like what it felt like when something heavy finally put itself down. And Sylphie Sloane, gorgeous and brilliant. Brilliant and built sturdy, Seoul from Jacksonville, Florida, who had come 12 hours across the world chasing an opportunity and found something she hadn't known to look for. She decided in that moment that she wasn't going anywhere. Not for a very long time. If this story found its way to your heart, drop a heart in the comments right now. It was because Kim Jin-woo went from untouchable to learning that the walls he built were never actually keeping him safe. And it took one black woman from Florida, speaking Russian in a Seoul corridor at 7 in the morning, out to show him what was on the other side. Sylphie didn't just save his life. She saved him the years he would have spent believing that distance was the same thing as strength. What was your favorite moment? The corridor, the 47th floor, the courtyard behind the blue gate, or the laugh? Tell me below. And if you've ever shown up somewhere you weren't supposed to be because it was the right thing to do, your story belongs in the comments. Smash that like button and subscribe right now. Shaya, because the best love stories don't start with perfect timing. They start with one person brave enough to move when they're terrified. Sometimes the person who saves your life in the morning is the same person who changes it completely. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough and wise enough to finally open the door, they stay.